The airport smelled of stale coffee and recycled air, a sensory reminder that she was stepping out of one life and into another, if only temporarily. Mariana Herrera gripped the handle of her worn-out suitcase, its edges frayed from years of moving between worlds, a stark contrast to the woman she had become, poised, independent, and far from the struggling single mother she had once been. Yet as she stared at the flight information board, her stomach twisted with an unease she couldn't quite name, though she told herself it was simply grief, the kind that came with burying a man who had once been a father to her. Ecuador was no longer home, not really. Not after she had clawed her way out of the suffocating grasp of poverty and heartbreak, building a life for herself and her son in Canada. Yet the moment she stepped onto the plane, she felt the weight of her past pressing down on her chest like a second skin, the ghosts of old memories lurking just beneath the surface. She had left Ecuador behind, but it had never truly left her, and as the plane rumbled down the runway, lifting into the ink-black sky, she closed her eyes and exhaled, telling herself that this was only a visit, a brief moment to say goodbye, to pay her respects, and then she would return to the world she had built, the one where she was strong, unbreakable, and safe. Yet as much as she tried to push it aside, the thought of seeing Javier sent a tremor through her resolve, because he had been the one constant in her life, the man who had held her when she cried, who whispered promises against her skin in the dead of night, who made her believe that love, true love, was not only possible but hers to claim. And yet, there was something unsettling about his insistence on picking her up from the airport, something that didn't quite sit right in her gut, though she blamed it on her own exhaustion, dismissing it as paranoia, because wasn't this the man she had trusted with her heart, the one who had vowed to protect her at all costs, the one who had been waiting for her return for years? The plane landed with a jolt, snapping her out of her thoughts, and as she stepped into the humid embrace of the Quito night, a wave of nostalgia washed over her, thick and cloying, bringing with it the scent of damp earth, grilled street food, and the distant sound of laughter. This was the place where she had been born, the place where she had fought to survive, the place she had sworn she would never let define her again. And yet, as she spotted Javier in the crowd, his familiar face breaking into a smile that once would have set her heart ablaze, she felt a flicker of uncertainty lodge itself deep in her chest, because there was something different in his eyes, something she couldn't quite name, something that sent a whisper of warning through her veins. But before she could examine it, his arms were around her, his lips at her ear, murmuring how much he had missed her, how things hadn't been the same without her, how he had been counting down the days until they could finally be together again. And she let herself sink into the warmth of his embrace, telling herself that she was being ridiculous, that this was the man she had loved for years, that she was simply overwhelmed by grief, exhaustion, and the weight of returning to a past she had fought so hard to leave behind. But then, as he guided her toward the sleek black car waiting by the curb, as he opened the door with a charming smile, as he placed her suitcase in the trunk with the ease of a man who had done it 1,000 times before, she caught it, that flicker, that almost imperceptible shift in his expression, the way his smile didn't quite reach his eyes, the way his fingers tensed around the handle of her bag. And though she told herself it was nothing, that she was imagining things, that Javier was the same man he had always been, she couldn't quite shake the feeling that something was wrong, that something had changed, that the man standing before her was not the man she thought she knew. And as the car pulled away from the airport, as the city lights blurred past in a dizzying array of gold and crimson, as Javier reached over and squeezed her hand, murmuring about how good it was to have her back, she forced herself to smile, to nod, to pretend that everything was fine, because maybe it was, maybe she was just tired, maybe the grief was making her paranoid. But then he took a wrong turn, and her stomach clenched, because this wasn't the way to her hotel, this wasn't the road she remembered. And when she turned to him, questioning the sudden detour, he simply chuckled, his fingers tightening ever so slightly around the steering wheel, his voice laced with something she couldn't quite place as he told her not to worry, that he had a surprise for her, that she was going to love it. And in that moment, in the space between one breath and the next, Mariana knew something was terribly, terribly wrong. The tires hummed against the uneven road, the city lights fading into the distance as Mariana's unease solidified into something heavier, something darker. And though she tried to mask the rising tension in her body, her fingers twitched in her lap, her breath shallowed, her heart beat a rapid staccato against her ribs as she forced a smile, her voice carefully even as she asked again where they were going. But this time, Javier didn't answer, not right away, not until they were deep in the rural outskirts of Quito, where streetlights were scarce and the night stretched out like a yawning abyss, swallowing the car in an oppressive silence that made her skin crawl. Then, at last, he turned to her, his eyes flickering with something unreadable, something cold, something that made her blood run icy in her veins as he murmured, "Just trust me, mi amor," and though those words had once been a source of comfort, now they dripped with something sinister, something that set every nerve in her body into alarm, because trust was the last thing she felt. Before she could react, before she could demand answers or demand he turn around, the car came to a sudden stop in the middle of nowhere, the headlights casting eerie shadows over the dirt road, illuminating the thick forest that surrounded them, and in the span of a single heartbeat, she knew this was wrong, all of it was wrong, and then the doors flung open, rough hands seizing her before she could scream, her body yanked out of the car and onto the cold, unforgiving ground, her pulse exploding in terror as she kicked, fought, screamed, but the hands were stronger, unyielding, shoving a rag over her mouth, the scent acrid, chemical, and suffocating, darkness creeping at the edges of her vision as she struggled, fought, clawed at the hands restraining her, but her limbs grew heavy, her screams slurred into muffled gasps, and just before the world went black, the last thing she saw was Javier standing by the car, his expression impassive, his arms crossed over his chest, and the last thing she heard before oblivion swallowed her whole was the sound of his voice, calm and detached, as he uttered a single sentence that shattered everything. "Take her." When Mariana awoke, the world was different, the air thick with dampness, the scent of mildew and earth wrapping around her like a suffocating shroud, and as she blinked through the disorienting haze, her body sluggish and foreign, she realized she was no longer in the car, no longer in the city, no, she was somewhere else entirely, somewhere where the walls were rough stone and the only light came from a single, flickering bulb overhead, its dim glow casting grotesque shadows along the cold concrete floor. Panic roared through her veins as she struggled to sit up, but her wrists burned, the biting sensation of zip ties digging into her skin making her stomach lurch, and that's when she realized she was bound, her ankles shackled, her wrists restrained. Her freedom reduced to nothing more than a cruel illusion, and as the reality of her situation crashed down on her, a sharp, visceral terror unlike anything she had ever known flooded her system. Because this wasn't just a mistake, this wasn't just a robbery, this wasn't some random act of violence, this was planned, calculated, deliberate, and at the center of it all was the man she had loved, the man she had trusted, the man who had kissed her just hours before and promised that everything would be okay. Nausea clawed at her throat as she struggled against the restraints, her breath coming in sharp, erratic bursts as she tried to make sense of the betrayal slicing through her like a blade. But before she could spiral further, footsteps echoed down the hallway, the sound slow and deliberate, each step a nail in the coffin of whatever fragile hope she had clung to, and then the door creaked open, revealing a man she had never seen before, broad-shouldered, his face obscured by the shadows, his voice a low, gravelly drawl as he murmured something in Spanish to someone just beyond the doorway, something about the package being secured and waiting for further instructions. And though the words sent a fresh wave of terror through her, it wasn't until the second voice spoke that she felt the ground beneath her crumble, because it was familiar, painfully, intimately familiar. A voice that had whispered sweet nothings in her ear, a voice that had promised her forever, a voice that now sealed her fate like a death sentence. Javier. The sound of his name on her own lips was a breathless, shattered whisper, her mind refusing to process the impossible truth unraveling before her. But as he stepped into the dim light, as his face came into view, as she saw the absence of guilt, the absence of remorse, the sheer indifference in his dark, familiar eyes, the breath she had been holding collapsed from her lungs, because there was no mistaking it, no denying it. This wasn't a mistake, this wasn't a misunderstanding, this was betrayal. She wanted to scream, to demand answers, to curse his name until her voice gave out, but no words came, only silence. Only the deafening roar of her own heartbeat pounding in her skull as he crouched in front of her, his gaze sweeping over her bound form with a detached curiosity, as if she were nothing more than a pawn in a game she hadn't realized she was playing, and when he finally spoke, his voice was almost gentle, almost amused, as he murmured, "I told you to trust me, Mariana," as if he hadn't just destroyed the very foundation of her reality. as if he hadn't just shattered her world into a million irreparable pieces. Rage boiled beneath her terror, a volatile, searing thing that threatened to consume her whole, but she bit down on it, forcing herself to breathe, forcing herself to stay silent, because if there was one thing she knew, it was that she couldn't afford to break, not now, not yet, because if she did, she would never make it out of this alive. So instead, she held his gaze, swallowing down the scream clawing at her throat, and though her heart was breaking, though the pain was unbearable, she made a silent vow in that moment, a vow forged in the ruins of their love. She would survive this, and more than that, she would make him pay. The hours bled together, turning minutes into eternities, the darkness stretching long and unyielding as Mariana sat against the cold, unfeeling stone, her wrists raw from struggling against the plastic bindings, her mind a frenzied whirlwind of fear, betrayal, and the suffocating weight of the unknown. The dampness in the air settled in her lungs like a sickness, making her shiver, making her body ache. But it was nothing compared to the ache in her chest, a hollow, splintering thing that threatened to break her from the inside out, because no matter how many times she replayed the events in her mind, no matter how desperately she searched for another explanation, another truth, there was only one. Javier had done this to her. Javier had sold her out. Javier had never truly loved her. The thought was a dagger to her ribs, twisting deeper with every breath, but she refused to let the pain consume her, refused to drown in the suffocating tide of grief and anger, because grief wouldn't save her, anger wouldn't break her free, only strategy would, and if she was going to survive, if she was going to make it out of this hell alive, she had to push past the betrayal, push past the fear, and start thinking like them, like the kind of people who had brought her here, who saw her as nothing more than a bargaining chip, a problem to be solved, a body to be discarded. Her mind latched onto that thought, dissecting it, analyzing it, because if she was a problem, if she was just another obstacle in whatever game Javier was playing, that meant there was a purpose to all of this, a reason she was still alive, because if they had wanted her dead, if this was merely about silencing her, she wouldn't be shackled to a floor, she wouldn't be left in a room where she could still breathe, still think, still fight. No, they needed something from her, something valuable enough to keep her alive, and whatever that something was, it was the only leverage she had. She closed her eyes, forcing her breath to slow, forcing her heartbeat to steady, because panic was the enemy now. Panic made her weak, panic made her prey, and she had spent too many years clawing her way out of the dark to let herself slip back into helplessness. Not now, not after everything, not when she had survived worse, endured worse, not when she had fought for every inch of the life she had built, because she wasn't the same woman she had been all those years ago, the woman who had once let life dictate her fate, who had let men decide her worth, who had believed that love was something that could save her. No, love had damned her, love had brought her here, and if she was going to escape, if she was going to make it out of this hellhole with her life, she had to do what she had never dared to do before. She had to let love die. She had to kill the last piece of herself that still wanted to believe Javier had ever been anything more than a lie. Her lips pressed into a thin, bloodless line as she opened her eyes, the cold resolve settling into her bones like steel, because survival wasn't about emotion, wasn't about mourning what had been lost, it was about adaptation, about outthinking the people who had underestimated her, about playing a game she hadn't even realized she was in until it was almost too late. But it wasn't too late, not yet, because she was still breathing, still thinking, and as long as she had that, she had a chance. The door groaned open suddenly, the harsh overhead bulb flickering as a shadow filled the doorway, and she forced herself to stay still, to keep her expression blank, even as her pulse roared in her ears, even as every instinct screamed at her to recoil. Because if there was one thing she had learned from a lifetime of fighting to survive, it was that fear was a weapon, and she refused to let them see hers. The man stepped closer, his boots heavy against the floor, his features obscured by the dim light, but she could see enough. The thick scar running from his temple to his jaw, the cold calculation in his dark eyes, the way he studied her, as if he were assessing something, weighing her worth, deciding whether she was more valuable alive or dead, and she knew then, with sickening clarity, that whatever purpose they had kept her alive for was fragile, temporary, and the moment she outlived her usefulness, the moment she became more trouble than she was worth, she would die. She tilted her chin up, forcing herself to meet his gaze, to keep her voice steady as she asked, "Why am I here?" and though she expected silence, expected cruelty, expected another layer of unknowns to pile on top of the ones already suffocating her, what she didn't expect was for him to laugh, a low, humorless chuckle that sent ice crawling down her spine as he crouched in front of her, his gaze flicking over her restrained form before he murmured, "Because you were stupid enough to trust the wrong man." The word stung, not because they weren't true, but because they were a confirmation of what she had already known, what she had already felt deep in her bones, that Javier had done this not in a moment of weakness, not out of desperation, but with intent, with calculation, with a plan. Her fingers curled into fists, the sharp bite of her nails grounding her, keeping her rage contained, because she couldn't afford to lose control, not yet, not when there was still a game to play, and if she was going to survive, if she was going to win, she needed more than just anger, she needed information. She exhaled slowly, shifting just enough that the movement seemed natural, controlled, her voice carefully measured as she asked, "What does he want?" And this time, the man didn't laugh, didn't mock her. This time, he only smiled, slow and knowing, before standing and turning toward the door, his parting words a dagger of their own, "You'll find out soon enough." The door slammed shut behind him, the lock clicking into place. And though the sound should have filled her with dread, should have chipped away at whatever fragile hope remained, she only felt one thing, a cold, unwavering certainty that no matter what Javier wanted, no matter what was coming next, she would not break, she would not beg, and she would not die in this room. No, if she was going to go down, it would be on her own terms, but she wasn't planning on going down at all. She was planning on surviving, on outsmarting them, on getting out of this hell alive, and more than that, she was planning on making Javier regret the day he ever thought he could betray her and get away with it. The passage of time blurred into a monotonous cycle of hunger, exhaustion, and the relentless ache of captivity, but Mariana refused to let it break her, refused to let it sink into her bones and make her fragile, because fragility meant death, and she wasn't ready to die, not now, not ever. She watched, she listened, she memorized every detail, every shift in the routine of her captors, cataloging their movements, their conversations, the things they carelessly revealed when they thought she was too exhausted, too broken to absorb their words, because knowledge was power, and if she was going to survive, if she was going to win, she needed every weapon at her disposal. It was in those stolen moments, in the whispers that carried through the cracks in the walls, that she learned the truth. This wasn't a ransom situation, this wasn't about money, this was a hit, a slow, drawn-out execution. And Javier had orchestrated it all. Her stomach clenched at the revelation, nausea coiling in her gut like a living thing, but she forced herself to breathe through it, to push past the horror, because horror was a luxury she couldn't afford, not when she was still alive, not when there was still a way out. She had spent days wondering why she was still breathing, why they hadn't simply killed her the moment she had been dragged into this place, but now she understood. Javier had made a mistake, a fatal miscalculation. He had assumed that the men he had hired would carry out the job without question, that they would dispose of her like an afterthought, but what he had failed to account for, what his arrogance had blinded him to, was the fact that men like these didn't kill without reason, didn't pull the trigger without assurance that it wouldn't come back to haunt them. And Mariana was a loose end. She had seen their faces, had heard their voices, had survived longer than intended, and now, doubt had begun to fester in their ranks, uncertainty gnawing at the edges of their loyalty, because men like these didn't work for blind promises, they worked for guarantees, and Javier, in all his calculated cruelty, had failed to provide one. It started as murmurs, quiet discussions in the dead of night, hushed arguments beyond her prison door, and then, on the sixth night, the shift changed. The man with the scar, the one who had studied her like she was nothing more than an inconvenience, entered her cell, but this time, his expression was different, the sharp edges of his indifference blunted by something she hadn't seen before, reluctance. He crouched before her, his fingers idly tapping against his knee as he studied her, as if weighing an impossible decision, and then, after a long silence, he exhaled heavily, shaking his head as he muttered, "Seems your boyfriend underestimated you, Querida." Something sharp and electric surged through her veins at the words, a glimmer of something she had not dared to name, something dangerously close to hope, but she forced herself to stay still, to keep her expression carefully neutral, because one wrong move, one wrong word, and whatever fragile thread of possibility existed in this moment could snap. The man studied her for a moment longer before leaning in, his voice lower, almost amused as he murmured, "You know why you're still alive, don't you?" And Mariana, despite the weight of exhaustion pressing down on her, despite the days of hunger clawing at her stomach, lifted her chin, meeting his gaze. With steady defiance as she whispered, "Because I'm worth more alive than dead," a slow smile spread across his face, something resembling approval flickering in his dark eyes before he pushed himself to his feet. Nodding once before he turned toward the door, calling over his shoulder, "Get some rest, Mariana. You're leaving soon." The moment the door shut behind him, she exhaled a shaky breath, her body trembling from the adrenaline that surged through her veins, because this was it, the shift, the turning point, the moment where she wasn't just a victim, wasn't just a woman waiting for the inevitable, she was a player, a survivor, and she was about to rewrite the ending of this story. The next 24 hours were a blur of preparation, of hushed exchanges between her captors, of supplies being gathered, of Mariana, through sheer force of will, regaining enough strength to stand, to walk, to think beyond survival and toward revenge. When the time came, it was quick. There was no ceremony, no dramatic escape. Only the silent exchange of a gun between men who had decided that Javier's money wasn't worth the trouble, only the rough shove of a bag being pressed into her hands, the sharp murmur of instructions, and then, freedom. She barely had time to process it as they shoved her toward a waiting car. As she climbed inside, as the engine roared to life and the road stretched out before her, leading her away from the nightmare that had nearly been her end, but she didn't feel free, not yet. Not until she was safe, not until she had won. The journey back to Canada was a blur, her body moving on autopilot, exhaustion clinging to her bones, but her mind, was sharper than it had ever been, honed by rage, by purpose, by the single, burning goal that consumed her, exposing Javier, destroying him, making him feel even a fraction of the fear he had made her endure. She gathered everything, every memory, every interaction, every detail that could prove what he had done, every whisper she had heard in the dark, every name, every location, and she built a case, a noose woven from his own treachery, one that she would tighten around his neck with ruthless precision. By the time her plane touched down in Canada, she was no longer the woman who had boarded the flight to Ecuador in mourning. No, that woman had died the moment she had heard his voice among her captors, and in her place stood someone new, someone stronger, someone who had stared death in the face and refused to yield. As she stepped onto Canadian soil, as she inhaled the crisp, familiar air of the place she called home, she made a silent vow. Javier thought he had won, thought he had buried her, thought he had erased her, but he was wrong. She had risen from the ashes of his betrayal, and now, she was coming for him. The sky was heavy with the weight of an impending storm, thick gray clouds stretching across the horizon like a warning, but to Mariana, it felt right. As if the world itself was preparing for the reckoning that was about to unfold. She stood just beyond the entrance of the church, the cold Canadian air nipping at her skin, the whispers of the crowd drifting toward her like a phantom, and for a fleeting moment, she allowed herself to close her eyes, to steady her breathing, to feel the magnitude of this moment. Javier thought she was dead, thought he had erased her, thought he had won, and now, as he sat inside the grand stone cathedral, playing the part of the grieving lover, surrounded by people who had come to mourn her, she was about to rip the mask from his face, to expose him for the monster he was, and for the first time in weeks, the agony of betrayal was eclipsed by something else. Satisfaction. She had spent every waking moment since her return preparing for this, had built a case so airtight that there would be no escape, no loophole, no chance for him to slither away like the snake he was. And now, as the final piece fell into place, as she prepared to step into the lion's den and watch his world crumble around him, she felt nothing but control. Her fingers grazed the edge of the thin USB drive tucked into the lining of her coat, the weight of it grounding her, because it was more than just a collection of evidence. It was justice, it was proof, it was the end of Javier's carefully constructed lies, and it was hers. She took a step forward, then another, her heartbeat steady, her breath even, and as she pushed open the heavy wooden doors, the hush that fell over the room was almost deafening. At first, there was only silence, the echo of her heels against the polished floor the only sound in the cavernous space, and then, gasps, sharp inhales of shock. The shifting of bodies as heads turned, as eyes widened, as disbelief swept through the gathered Mourners like a shockwave, she let it happen, let them see her, let them take in the woman who was supposed to be nothing more than a tragic memory, because this moment was hers to control, and she had learned, she had learned, that control was the most powerful weapon of all. She saw her mother first, frozen in place, her eyes wide with unshed tears, her trembling fingers gripping the prayer book in her lap. And then she saw the others, the friends, the acquaintances, the strangers who had come to pay their respects to a woman they thought had been taken too soon, but none of them mattered, not in this moment, not now. No, there was only one person she was looking for, only one reaction that she was waiting to see, and then, there he was. Javier sat in the front row, his head bowed, his expression carefully crafted into a mask of grief. His fingers curled around the edge of the pew as if the weight of his own deception was too much to bear, and for a second, just a second, she almost marveled at his audacity, at the sheer theatricality of it all, because he hadn't just gotten away with his betrayal, he had performed it, had orchestrated it into something so convincing that even now, with the truth unraveling before him, he still clung to the lie. But then, as if sensing the shift in the room, he lifted his head, his gaze sweeping over the faces of the mourners before finally, landing on hers, and in that instant, everything changed. She saw it all, every flicker of emotion that crossed his face, every minute crack in the armor of his deception. First, confusion, the kind that came with seeing the impossible, then realization, sharp and brutal, followed by fear, stark and undeniable, and beneath it all, panic, the frantic, desperate kind that only came when a man realized his world was about to collapse around him. She held his gaze. Let him drown in the weight of his own downfall, let him feel every ounce of the power he had tried to steal from her, and then, she took another step forward, slow, deliberate, unwavering. The hush in the room grew heavier, the whispers morphing into a low, rippling murmur of disbelief, but she didn't waver, didn't break her gaze from the man who had orchestrated her death, because this moment wasn't for them, it was for her. She watched as Javier's hands curled into fists, as his jaw clenched, as he tried, desperately, to regain control of the situation, to force himself back into the role of the grieving lover, but it was too late, and he knew it, she knew it. The lie had shattered, the illusion had crumbled, and now all that remained was truth, raw, undeniable, inescapable truth. She took one last step, closing the distance between them, her voice quiet but razor-sharp as she murmured, "Did you miss me, mi amor?" And in that moment, as the color drained from his face, as the weight of his own crimes bore down on him, she saw something she had never seen in Javier before, defeat. But this wasn't the end, no. This was just the beginning, because Mariana Herrera had not just returned from the dead, she had returned to bury the man who had tried to destroy her, and as she reached into her pocket, her fingers closing around the USB drive that held his ruin, she allowed herself the smallest of smiles, because for the first time in weeks, she was no longer the hunted, she was the hunter. The storm finally broke as Mariana stepped out of the church, the heavy clouds surrendering to a cascade of cold rain, but she barely felt it, barely noticed the icy droplets soaking into her hair, her clothes, her skin, because all she could feel was freedom, a raw, visceral thing that pulsed beneath her ribs, beating in rhythm with the storm, with the thunder that rumbled overhead like an omen of change, of endings, of beginnings. Behind her, the remnants of Javier's downfall still lingered. The gasps of mourners, the whispers of disbelief, the sound of his name, once revered, now tainted with scandal, with betrayal, with ruin, but none of it mattered, not anymore. Not when she had finally severed the last thread tethering her to the man who had tried to bury her, not when she had won. The evidence she had spent days compiling was already in the right hands, delivered to the authorities the moment she had stepped off the plane, and by the time the dust settled, by the time the whispers turned into headlines, into investigations, into handcuffs snapping around his wrists, there would be nothing left of the empire he had tried to build on the bones of her betrayal. He had underestimated her, they had all underestimated her, and now, as she walked into the rain, as the city stretched out before her, vast and endless, she felt it for the first time in years, possibility. She was no longer the woman who had boarded that plane to Ecuador, no longer the woman who had whispered, "I love you," into the ear of a man who had already sharpened the knife for her back, no longer the woman who had once believed that love was something that could save her. No, she had been broken, remade, reforged in fire and betrayal, and now, she was something new. The rain clung to her lashes as she walked, her fingers tightening around the strap of the bag slung over her shoulder. The only thing she had taken from her past life, filled not with memories, not with ghosts, but with plans, because she wasn't just walking away from Javier, from the nightmare he had trapped her in. She was walking toward something bigger, toward a future she was going to carve out with her own 2 hands. She had spent too much of her life waiting for love to be enough, waiting for people to prove their loyalty, waiting for the world to decide what she deserved, but waiting had nearly killed her, and she had no intention of making that mistake again. This time, she was going to take what she wanted, build the life she deserved, and she wasn't going to let anyone, stand in her way. She didn't know exactly where she was going, didn't know what the next chapter of her life looked like. But that was the beauty of it. She didn't need to know. She didn't need to have a plan laid out in meticulous detail, because for the first time in her life, she trusted herself. And that was more powerful than any roadmap, any destination, any promise whispered between the sheets by a man who had only ever seen her as a pawn. She had survived the impossible, had stood at the edge of the abyss and refused to fall, had looked death in the face and smiled. And if she could do that, if she could rise from the grave Javier had dug for her, then she could do anything. A small part of her, the part that had loved him, that had once dreamed of forever, felt a distant, ghostly ache at the thought of what could have been, of the future they had once promised each other. But she let it go, let it die in the cold air, in the spaces between the raindrops, because that love had never been real, not in the way she had believed. And now, she had no use for illusions, for fairy tales. What she wanted now was real, tangible, earned, and she was willing to fight for it, willing to burn down whatever stood in her way to claim it. She didn't need closure, didn't need a neat ending, didn't need to stand outside that church and listen to the aftermath of the storm she had unleashed. She had done what she came to do, had taken back her power, had made sure Javier would never hurt anyone else the way he had hurt her, and now, she was free. She took a deep breath, the crisp city air filling her lungs, washing away the last traces of fear, of grief, of the woman she had been before. And as she turned the corner, as she stepped into the glow of the streetlights, she smiled, not because everything was perfect, not because the pain had disappeared entirely, but because she knew, deep in her bones, that she was going to be okay. She had walked through the fire, had emerged from the wreckage stronger, sharper, more alive than ever before, and that was enough, more than enough. This wasn't just survival, wasn't just revenge, wasn't just the end of a terrible chapter. This was her rebirth, and as the city stretched before her, vast and waiting, she knew, without a single shred of doubt, that her story was just beginning.